Welcome to Chess Dog. I'm John Montgomery. Today we have a game between Alireza Firouzja and Sergey Karjakin played at the NIC Classic. This is a game in 15 between the two players. Obviously, these are very elite players. Sergey Karjakin rated 2757 and Alireza Firouzja rated 2759. Let's jump right in and see what happens. Alireza has the white pieces. Karjakin has the black pieces, and Alireza begins the game with d4. Karjakin plays knight to f6, and after knight f3, d5, e3, we have a Kali system on the board where white is delaying the advance of this c-pawn. And when that happens, basically what white is doing is playing a black system in reverse. For example, as the game progresses, c5 is the move played by Karjakin, and Firouzja takes the pawn. And essentially, this is like a Vienna variation in reverse. So, for example, if it begun d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, knight f6, knight f3, then take. And Firouzja does play this Vienna variation as black. So basically, he gets the same thing with white. e6 hits the pawn at c5, the bishop at f8. b4 defends the pawn, a5, undermining the structure. c3 defending the structure. Pawn takes, and b6. Again, Karjakin trying to undermine Firouzja's queenside structure. It would be a mistake for Firouzja to take the pawn at b6 because of bishop to b4 check, and black would just be better. So instead, he plays bishop to b5 check himself, and after bishop to d7 takes, he castles. The main move here is actually a4. So after pawn takes, you play b5, and you have a battle between the queenside pawns and the central pawns for black. What ends up happening is we get this exact same position, just in a different move order. Firouzja castles first, and after pawn takes, he plays b5. After bishop to d6, a4. So essentially, we have the same position. The battle lines are drawn. Firouzja is going to play on the queen side, trying to advance those two pawns, the a and b pawns. Karjakin wants to blockade those pawns, keep them from advancing, and then advance his own pawns in the center. That's the basic goal of the two positions. Castles, bishop to b2. Firouzja puts the bishop on that very nice long diagonal. Queen to b8. Puts the queen in front of those pawns, but also aims at the h2 pawn for white. So a dual purpose move. Knight b to d2, rook to c8. Karjakin knows that if he can stop those queenside pawns from Firouzja, he'll be in good shape. So he moves his final heavy piece to the queenside. Queen to c2. Firouzja would like to get in the move e4 if he can. That undermines the central structure for Karjakin and can create some weak squares in the position. So the queen and the knight both aim to play e4. h6, rook f to b1, backing up his pawns. e5 with the threat of e4, and that would kick the knight at f3 away and then hit the h2 pawn with the queen and bishop battery. So Firouzja plays g3 to sort of blunt that diagonal of the queen and the bishop. So with that diagonal being blunted, Karjakin moves the bishop in a blockading position to help keep these two pawns from advancing by controlling b6 and a5. Now e4 is played, and this really does weaken the central light squares for Karjakin, and that allows Firouzja to put his pieces on some very nice squares. On the upside, Karjakin does get a protected passed pawn, but that's not much of an issue at the moment. d4, and now this gorgeous c4 square that Firouzja can use, particularly for his knights. A knight on that square controls a5 and b6. So that's a great achievement for Firouzja. Knight goes to c4. The bishop goes to a5. Now bishop to d2. The bishop for Firouzja isn't that great on b2. So he wants to go to d2 to challenge the blockading bishop at a5 and help undermine the blockade of his queenside pawns. Queen to b7. Now he plays bishop to d2 to challenge the bishop at a5. Now you might ask the question, as I did, what if he just plays knight to d6, forking the queen and the rook, right? Pretty simple. Well, there's a problem. Karjakin would happily allow this to happen, and he would respond by queen to b6, knight takes rook, rook takes knight. And now, Firouzja's queenside pawns would be completely blockaded, and Karjakin would be able to freely advance his c and d pawns forward. And the extra rook, the exchange that Firouzja has, wouldn't be worth that much because there are no open files at all on the board, and it would be very hard for him to activate that piece. So this would be a great position for Karjakin, even though he would be down in exchange. So he would have happily allowed this. So Firouzja does not play knight to d6. Instead, he plays bishop to d2, continuing to challenge the blockade. Bishop goes back to c7 and controls that d6 square just in case. Now b6. The pawns begin to advance. Karjakin cannot take that b6 pawn. If he takes with a knight, a5, there's a pin down the file. And if he takes with the bishop, same story. So he has to retreat. So he retreats the bishop to b8. The rook goes to e1 to help defend e4, which is attacked by the knight at f6 and the queen at b7. Rook to a6 to hit the pawn at b6, and now a5. And this is a tremendous achievement for Firouzja. He's advanced those pawns one square each, and Karjakin is blockading those pawns with a queen and a rook. Literally the worst possible pieces you could be using to blockade pawns. That's the situation Karjakin finds himself in. Rook goes to e8 to help defend the e5 pawn. Knight to h4. Firouzja aims at that very nice, very juicy f5 square. Rook to e6, knight to f5. And now Karjakin wants to get rid of that knight on f5, which is very well placed. If he plays g6, then just knight to h6. Check would be a free pawn. So instead he plays h5 first to get the pawn away from that knight threat. And now he does threaten g6. Queen to d3, put some pressure on the a6 square. g6, the knight is kicked away, knight h4. The rook moves away to a8. The knight comes back to f3 to reroute itself to the queen side to help the pawns advance. The queen goes to a6. Knight to g5, hits the rook at e6, goes to e7. And now queen to b3. Firouzja has put his queen on a very nice square. It helps support the b-pawn advance and also puts a little bit of unpleasant and indirect pressure on the f7 pawn that the knight at g5, the queen at b3 are both pressuring. The knight goes to e8. That knight wants to go to d6 because this knight at c4 is so well placed. So go to d6 and get rid of that knight. That's what Karjakin would like to happen. Rook a to b1 to help advance the b pawn. Knight d to f6. Queen to b5. That was the idea of rook to b1. He wants to exchange off the blockading queen, get rid of black's blockading pieces. Queen takes b5, rook takes b5. Now knight back to d7 to help defend c5, which was undefended. And rook to c1. Now rook to c1 may not look like much, but to me this is very much a super grandmaster move. Because what Firouzja understands is that control of the c4 square, the one the knight sits on right now, is absolutely critical. If he can keep that c5 pawn from advancing and keep that pawn fixed there, and keep that c4 pawn blockaded, or the c4 square as the blockading square, then Karjakin really doesn't have much of a chance. So he plays rook to c1 to help control that square. The knight goes to d6. The knight has to be traded, and the rook controls c4, keeps that from advancing. The knight goes back to f3, rerouting towards the queen side, and Karjakin tries to generate some play with f5 on the king side, but Firouzja has a very nice answer to this. First, he plays bishop to g5, attacking the rook. The rook has to move, and now the knight comes back to d2. It helps support the e4 pawn, but it also aims at the c4 square. So the knight that was there that got traded off is now potentially going to be replaced by the other knight on the board. Really efficient, beautiful use of the pieces. King to f7. Karjakin wants to centralize his king in the endgame. The knight goes to c4, hitting the bishop at d6, among other things. The king goes to e6, defending. Now, f3, helping to strengthen the e4 square. Rook to a6 to keep the pawn blockaded. b7. Now there's real pressure. Now the queening square is controlled 3 times. The knight, the bishop, and the rook at e8 all control it. But if Firouzja can distract those pieces, then that's going to be it. So rook to f8. What Karjakin would like to do is exchange these pawns, play his rook to f3, and maybe get behind the structure, penetrate on the file. So Firouzja plays king to g2. Now there are no penetration points at all for Karjakin's rook at f8. Bishop to b8, rook c to b1, backing up that passed pawn. Bishop c7. It appears at this point Karjakin is just moving his pieces back and forth, hoping that Firouzja cannot break through. Bishop to c1, rerouting the bishop to a more aggressive post. Bishop b8 again. Bishop to a3, attacking the c5 square. Bishop to a7 to defend it. Rook to e1, creating some indirect pressure towards the e5 pawn if the e pawn gets exchanged. g5. And now Firouzja begins his final combination. ef5 check, king takes pawn, knight takes e5. Now it would be a mistake for Karjakin to take that knight, because then bishop c5, and after bishop takes, rook takes, and the knight is pinned. After rook to b8 check, king moves, and the rook goes back to b8 to defend that pawn, and it's too much material. This is a very easily winning endgame for Firouzja. So instead, Karjakin plays rook to e8 to pin the knight to the rook at e1. There are a number of options here, but what Firouzja does is take the knight at d7. He says, you can have my rook. I just have too much pressure on the queening square now, so you can take my rook, which he does. And then bishop to c5. And the final potential blockader of the b pawn, the bishop at a7, is removed. And Karjakin resigned. An excellent, a really positional victory. It really shows how the controlling of certain key squares and the efficient use of the pieces is the key to victory in chess. I hope you enjoyed the game. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.